Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from London, Ontario, Canada. His name is Brian Martin, and he just published an excellent book. I highly recommend this book. The full title is From Underground Railroad to Rebel Refuge, Canada in the Civil War. And it's really interesting. It has just a different take on the background of the relationship between Canada and the U.S. in the 19th century. A lot of information that I wasn't aware of, and I learned a lot from reading the book. It's just published October 25th, 2022. There's an ebook, Kindle, and a hardcover version of it. Mr. Martin has written 10 books. He's written on other subjects, 6 on baseball, very prolific author, and has 41 years in journalism. He is an award-winning journalist for more than 40 years, like I said, telling the stories of southwestern Ontario, where most of the From the Underground Railroad to Rebel Refuge takes place. And he's written 2 true crime books as well as the 6 about baseball. So I'm glad to have him on the show. So Brian Martin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, William. It's good to be here.
Excellent. So for people who may not have heard your name, can you kind of talk about your background and then what led you to put together this very well written and very well put together book?
Well, thank you. I grew up in the Toronto area, and I came down to London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours to the southwest, to attend university. Took journalism. I applied all over the place. I wound up at the newspaper here in London, and I spent 41 years writing the stories of people and places and the history of southwestern Ontario, which is the area that stretches from if your viewers can imagine a map, if you could imagine where Detroit is and where Buffalo is, we are that chunk of Canada that hangs down low and is on the north side of Lake Erie. It's called Southwestern Ontario, and London is the center of it. It's the largest city in that part of the Ontario, and I think it's the 10th largest city in the country now. And we were a very manufacturing sector. We were part of a rich agricultural region, and lots of businesses are here. So it's a city today of about 450,000, and back at the time of the Civil War, it had about 15,000. But it was a small city at the time, but an influential one. I've written a number of books, and I've made some great contacts with some historians in the city of London here and in the area. And there was a time about 2 years ago, a friend of mine who's a historian, he also happens to be an undertaker of all things. He's got a terrific sense of humor. He's a very dedicated historian, and he and I were chatting, and he mentioned that there had been there's a rumor that there's some Confederate gold buried in his basement of his house, because after the Civil War, a fellow escaped from the Confederacy and came up here and lived for a time. And apparently he did some witching, some fellow that does the witching like you do for water or whatever. And
Dowsing, yeah.
Dowsing, that's it. That's the word. Thank you. And believes that there's some anomaly in the well in the basement of his house. Anyways, we were talking about that. And then he said, and there were a lot of people up here that, came up here after the Civil War, plantation owners, people who had enslaved Black people. And we had, people. And I said, really? And he says, yeah. So he took me out to one of the large cemeteries in London here, Woodland Cemetery. And he showed me a cluster of headstones. And all the headstones, there's about 12 or 15 of them, with carrying about almost 20 names. And they were all indicated as people from been born in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and they died here in London, Ontario. Well, the interesting thing, it struck me quite interesting. First of all, there's no natural or logical connection between a place like Charleston, South Carolina, and London, Ontario. It's 1,000 miles away as the bird flies. And I was saying, well, that's sort of interesting. And you say they came up here after the Civil War. He says, yeah. And the most interesting thing to me, and somewhat bothering actually to me, was the fact that they were all buried alongside some of the most prominent figures in the city, some of the wealthiest and most influential citizens. Your listeners and viewers may be aware of Labatt Brewery, or Labatt's Beer it's called, and the Labatt Brewery started here, and there's a big a marker for the Labatt family plot. These people from South Carolina are buried in that area, along with there's other leaders of the city. Some of the most prominent citizens of the city of London are also buried near the Labatts. Well, these people from 1,000 miles away are buried in what's called Millionaire's Row, amongst all these very prominent and influential citizens. And I said, well, that's odd too. So they've come 1,000 miles away. They're buried with our most prominent citizens. I need to know more about these people. Now, you should know where I'm from here, there's a lot of, this was the terminus for the Underground Railroad. And we knew for a long time that Black people had fled up here, following the North Star, trying to find Canaan and freedom. And they came in great numbers, and they were assisted all along the way on what was called the Underground Railroad. Once they got across the border, they were free men and women, and they decided to either settle in existing communities or in settlements that were established for them, communities that were established for them. And the government up here was willing to welcome people. Didn't matter what the color of their skin was. We needed people to settle this area. And in fact, we put out the welcome mat for them. And officially, we were still a British colony before the Civil War. And there was a welcome made for them. Now, it wasn't always a bowl of cherries, their life up here, but it certainly was better than what they had back in the States. We had no slavery. In fact, Ontario, which was called Upper Canada at the time, enacted the first legislation to limit slavery before 1800. And within a generation, slavery was gone. And then in Britain, they had the Slavery Abolition Act of 1834, I think it was. So we had abolished slavery. So this was people were free once they got here. The trick was getting here. And they would come through Buffalo or Lewiston, New York, or from Detroit in the West, and they would flood in here. West of London, there were a number of communities specifically established for Black people, and they were agricultural, and they had to clear the heavy bush that was here at the time. And in fact, they established fairly successful settlements. Some were more successful than others. So we knew about this, and I had written about this during my journalism career. So we knew that we had put out the welcome mat for people who had been escaping slavery. Well, I learned through my research that we'd also put out the welcome mat for all sorts of other people, including people who had been enslavers, people who had been plantation owners. And it turns out that some of those headstones that I discovered in London, two of them were a man named Manigault and another one named Mazik. And they were actually very, very, very wealthy rice plantation owners in Charleston, South Carolina area. And those two had been members of the South Carolina legislature that voted unanimously to secede from the Union in December of 1860. These were very prominent people who played a crucial role. South Carolina secession, that was the first state to secede. It was one of the tripping points for starting the Civil War. And of course, Fort Sumter was in South Carolina as well. So these people played a crucial role. The more I dug into it, I found, my goodness, what an interesting situation. And while here, they sort of settled in. They had no intention of going back. I guess the people they had enslaved had all been set free. Their plantations had been taken over. All they had was the money they came with. Now, they didn't have to work up here because they had sufficient funds, and they hung, I guess, with the elite of the city. And one of them, Manigault, he actually wrote a couple of rather racist books that defended the Confederacy and the fact that only large plantations run by white people could possibly succeed, things like that. So the people in London must have known about their tendencies, and yet they were still accepted. So I found it interesting that before the war, we had put down the welcome mat for people who were escaping slavery. And then after the war, we had the same welcome mat out, I guess, for people who had enslaved those earlier arrivals. Now, there was no sort of clash up here because London and to the east over toward Niagara tended to be where the Confederates and plantation owners tended to settle, whereas between London and down towards Windsor, Detroit to the west is where the largest concentration of former slaves and former enslaved persons and free Blacks had settled. So there wasn't really sort of a reenacting of some of the troubles from down south. Everybody sort of lived peaceably together, and I think the British authorities and then the Canadian authorities, we became Canada in 1867, sort of kept a lid on everything, and there was no particular problem of them living together. So anyway, bottom line is, I stumbled onto this by looking at some headstones. And if would this be a good time to show the one headstone?
Yes, yes, please do.
This is one of the, if I can put it up here right. Okay. Can that be read by you, William?
Gabriel Manigault, the Charleston, South Carolina, died in London, Ontario, January 20-something, 1889. Is that right?
I think it's 78, maybe. Anyway,
yeah.
At any rate,
1809. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, this was one of the two legislators from South Carolina, and he wrote a couple of those rather racist books once he was up here. So it was the cluster of these headstones that got me going on this whole project. So that's how it began, and those are some of the main things I learned through my research. I also learned, and I forgot to mention this, is that not only did people who had been enslavers and plantation owners come up here, but there were people who were wanted. The original Ku Klux Klan was called the Ku Klux. And after the Civil War, there were the white population, certain members of the white population were fearful of Black people having the right to vote and perhaps getting in charge. In South Carolina, for instance, only 40% of the population were white people, 60% were Black people. The white people in South Carolina, for instance, a number of them were unhappy at this turn of affairs, and a number of them resorted to joining the Ku Klux organization and resorted to violence to suppress the vote, cross burnings, lynchings, setting barns on fire, and all that sort of thing. So there was all this trouble that was going on there relating to the Ku Klux. Well, son of a gun, if London didn't attract Ku Klux people as well. A couple of the leaders of South Carolina, up from the north part of South Carolina, came here. One of them stayed here and became a respected doctor for a number of years. The other one came here briefly and then went over to Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is right at the border. And he owned a house there, a fairly substantial house, and owned it and held on to it for a long time. So we had all sorts of people come up here. And in the course of my research, I learned that in all, there were 40,000 Americans that came to Canada during the Civil War for various reasons, white and Black and Ku Klux people. And then at the same time, 20,000 Canadians went south and they joined both sides of the conflict. Most of them signed up for the Union side, but a few others signed up for the Confederate side. So it was a two-way street. The international border. We played a very interesting role. We had a front row seat to the terrible war that ripped your country apart. And well, I hate to say London, for instance, profited handsomely from that by selling to both sides of the conflict. And when the Civil War was over, after selling all these horses and crops and machinery and guns and all that sort of thing, we went into a bit of a recession.
Right, but there's so many major players have a bit of the Canadian territory in their background, whether it's Wilkes Booth, John Brown, Harriet Tubman. All these people all had one foot on Canadian border at one time, right? Or Canadian land.
Oh yeah. John Brown, he was up here raising money and trying to get volunteers to help him with his violent overthrow of the American government throughout 1858. He actually attended a conference, a secret conference in a place called Chatham, which is about halfway between here and Detroit to the west. And it was in a church, and it was a very secretive thing, but it was his first formulation of the plans to violently overthrow the American government and the initial plans for the Harper's Ferry, which didn't work out too well for him. It was a year later until he did it or tried it. But we also had John Wilkes Booth hanging around Montreal, and it sounds like he got the idea to assassinate Abraham Lincoln from his Confederate associates in the St. Lawrence Hotel, which was a big hotel. It was the center of one of the two centers of Confederate clandestine operations during the Civil War, and it catered to Southerners like crazy. It was one of the few places in Canada you could acquire a drink called mint juleps, which I've never had, but apparently it's quite a Southern drink. And this was in Montreal. The Confederacy had $600,000 for clandestine operations against the North. and they from bases in Toronto and Montreal. The raid on St. Albans in Vermont, which you may have heard of, where some Confederates crossed the border into Vermont, a sleepy little town at the north end of Vermont, and claimed this town of St. Albans for the Confederacy. And this got the attention of the northern authorities, and they started to be very wary of what was going on up in Canada. It was sort of a backdoor route to harass the Union, the Confederacy was doing. There was all sorts of stuff. There are more interesting characters in this than one can imagine.
It really is incredible. I mean, and it's interesting that the Canadian kind of territory at that time, before it became Canada, was so progressive regarding in slavery, and there were so many sensitive abolitionists there working to make it a free place. And who is this character? One of the interesting people I'd never heard of is Josiah Henson. Can you talk about him and his important terms?
Oh, yeah. Oh, Josiah Henson, I think originally came from Kentucky, and he worked his way north, had to walk. I think he walked 600 or 800 miles to get to the border, and he crossed from New York near Buffalo, a place called Black Rock, and he crossed immediately across the Niagara River into Canada at a place called Fort Erie, although where it was used to be called Waterloo. But at any rate, he came across on the ferry, and the ferry operator was absolutely astounded when Henson comes across, and he had members of his family with him, comes across, he throws himself on the ground, starts wriggling around, and the ferry operator, who thought he was having some sort of fit of some description, and he says, "What's going on, man?" And he says, I'm free. This is what freedom feels like." Well, Josiah Henson was worked for a little bit on a farm near Fort Erie, and then he walked all the way. He was put in charge of a group of black settlers, and he walked all the way to the other end of the province, down toward Windsor, or Detroit, Windsor, and he found an area near a place called Colchester, and they had a settlement down there that they farmed, and things were going pretty well. And then he hooked up with some other people that decided to put together an entirely black settlement at a place called Dresden. It was called Dawn. And he was one of the leaders of the settlement, although he was more of a titular leader and was a fundraiser. He wasn't a good administrator. And at any rate, he wrote about his life. And Harriet Beecher Stowe learned about his life, and she modeled her main character, Uncle Tom, from Uncle Tom's Cabin, after Josiah Henson. They had met, I think, in Boston, and Harriet Beecher Stowe was an anti-slavery person, and she wrote her novel, but she admitted later, under sort of vigorous cross-examination, that it was in fact Josiah Henson that was the model for her main character, even though her book was a novel. And Josiah Henson was very well respected. He was eventually received by American President Rutherford B. Hayes, and also by Queen Victoria. He was a figurehead. He worked very, very hard. He brought other black people to Canada as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and had a very long and successful life. And where he lived in the Dawn settlement, his house still exists, and it's been dubbed Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's part of a National Historic Site. So you can actually see the home of the man who inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin story, and see the cabin he actually lived in. Josiah Henson was a very interesting character and a leader. There were others. There was Harriet Tubman, and a number of others. But Josiah was the one that sort of caught people's fascination because of the Uncle Tom's book.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I didn't know that Harriet Beecher Stowe kind of followed up with, like, when people criticized her, she came out with another book justifying all her research and things like that.
Well, that to me, that was quite funny, because a novel is a novel. It's not truth. It's made up stuff. It comes out of people's heads. I'm a nonfiction writer. I couldn't possibly write a novel. I'm not that good a writer, and I wouldn't be able to keep the characters straight. And it's a different genre entirely. But she was criticized that this Uncle Tom character in her story was so unrealistic that, and even though it was a novel, she followed up with a book, you saw the title. It goes on for about 20
Right.
words, but it's her defense of her use of her defense of characters like Josiah Henson and Uncle Tom in her earlier book. I mean, that's interesting to me. I mean, here's a novelist trying to defend her novel writing as factual.
Like,
So anyway, who
right.
knows?
She doesn't need to. And
She
then, I
didn't
mean,
need to.
I think that she is considered one of the main three people who influenced the beginning of the Civil War, like her writing, um, Harper's Ferry, and then something else. Like she was super influential, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And just you mentioned it, and I don't want to for a minute leave a wrong impression here. Um, uh, while we were welcoming and we did our best, as from all my reading, there was in fact discrimination against the black people up here. Took the form of there was a member of parliament down in the Chatham area where the largest concentration of black people was. In fact, the town of Chatham, as it then was, about a third of the population of the community was black, and there was some resentment about them. There were some gerrymandering of some school district boundaries in order to exclude them. There were some other issues. The MP down there actually told people that he didn't want those people down here because it affects the property values. I mean, he was in the minority, but for the most part, they were accepted. And in fact, at the one settlement that they created, and there was this controversy among the black community themselves about whether they should be moving into existing communities and integrating immediately, or whether they should be in their own self-segregated communities to help each other in a sort of a collective way to succeed. Because sometimes they didn't not everyone had the skills needed to start a new life from scratch. So anyway, but the bottom line is at the one community, Buxton settlement near Chatham, which is the most successful one, was founded by a white Presbyterian minister who was from Ireland originally and then had been in Louisiana. His wife died. He inherited some enslaved people. He wasn't happy about that. He came to Canada and used the people that had been enslaved by him as the basis of this community. Well, this community did really well, and it one of the things that when black people came here, they wanted education. They had been denied education in the States. They felt education was the key to success. So in Buxton, their school was so good, a neighboring school shut down. And in fact, white children joined black children at the Buxton school. And I've got some photographs as late as the early 1900s, integrated classrooms, public school, elementary level school. But it was heartening for me to see that. I mean, white kids and black kids and all learning together and getting along. That was kind of nice. But it wasn't a bowl of cherries for everyone all the time. There were some issues.
Right. It's interesting. And you start really the first sentence in your book is about this woman. I never heard of, Chloe Cooley. Can you talk about her importance and her historical legacy?
Well, you're not alone because she's not well known. There's a plaque along the Niagara River to her, and it's only in recent years that people have sort of even that name is not familiar to people. Chloe Cooley, and in 1793, we had slavery here in the colony at that point, but there was a growing movement to abolition. And the governor of the colony came over from England, and he was an abolitionist. He didn't like slavery at all. But the legislature had a number of landowners and property owners and wealthy people who had slaves. So he had to move slowly. But when he heard the story about Chloe Cooley, that was the beginning of the end of slavery here. Chloe Cooley had come across the river and with a fellow who had fought with against the revolutionary side. He was on the British side, and he was granted land in Upper Canada as a reward. And he had a big farm along the Niagara River. And he got wind of the fact that this new governor was wanting to get rid of slavery, and that he was worried that his investment, if slavery was abolished, his investment and he had a couple of slaves at least, would be lost. So before the government could act, he figured, well, I'm going to sell this. He sold this lady to an American across the river in New York State. And Chloe Cooley didn't want to go. Chloe Cooley was a very high-spirited woman, and she knew what was happening and may have heard that perhaps abolition was coming to the colony. And when her owner told her that he was selling her to the state, she put up a big fuss. She had to physically be grabbed and forcibly taken down the riverside onto a boat and across the river to her new owner. This caused a great fuss. She put up one heck of a fight. It attracted neighbors and passersby who all thought this was just terrible what had happened. And they went to the legislature, which was very nearby. At that time, it was in Niagara on the Lake, just a few miles to the north. And eventually, Governor Simcoe learned about this, said, well, okay, we've got to start something. So they had an act to limit slavery was enacted because of the rough handling of Chloe Cooley. Now, we don't know what happened to Chloe Cooley. She was sold off. We never heard from her again. However, Simcoe, the guy who spearheaded the effort to begin the end of slavery, would be gone within a generation. He didn't want to abolish it right now because too many members of the legislature were enslavers, right? So it was within 20 years. No one was going to be retroactively freed, but anyone born from that point on would be considered a free person. So it would take about a generation before the vast majority of Black people would be free. Anyway, Simcoe didn't stay here that long. He was recalled to England and was about to be sent to another colony, or had been sent to another colony, when he took ill and died. However, his legacy is quite significant up here. We have a major lake, inland lake, called Simcoe. We have a town called Simcoe. We have a county called Simcoe. And he's well known. His tongue, we actually used to call the first holiday in August, Simcoe Day. So his name is well known. But Chloe Cooley, her name appears on a little plaque along a roadway along the Niagara River. And very, very few people in Canada, in Ontario, even know who Chloe Cooley is. So I decided to start the book with that, because that was the beginning of the end of slavery here, and the fact that it was followed up in a few years. And this was the first place in the entire British Empire that did anything to limit slavery. And then when in Britain in 1834, the abolition of slavery, that applied to us, of course. And then that sort of unlocked the doors. There had been a trickle before that, but when Britain formally abolished slavery, then that's when the Underground Railroad started to kick up, and we started seeing significant numbers of enslaved persons and free Blacks show up here.
Right, it was in the thousands, tens of thousands, right? Made it all the way to Canada.
Yeah, there were 40,000 altogether, 40,000 Americans. Because of censuses of the day, because of the time, we don't know the exact number. And I've seen numbers of 50 and 60,000. I took a rather conservative number of 40, and then 20,000 Canadians who went south. Now, some after the Civil War, some of the Black people returned to the States, and we have no idea of the numbers. But there is still, to this day, there's descendants of members of the Underground Railroad that still live in southwestern Ontario. Ferguson Jenkins, the Chicago pitcher, he grew up in Chatham. His mother was a descendant of people who came up on the Underground Railway. His father, I think, was from the Caribbean, but his mother was from that. And to this day, in that town of Chatham, there's still a considerable number of Black people, and everyone seems to get along fine.
Interesting, fascinating. And so, so they just assimilated, became workers on farms or things like that. I think it's
oh yeah. Now, I attended a thing recently, a bit of a discussion, and this young fellow thought I should be more angry that we didn't treat them better. But I mean, back then, we treated them far better than the life they knew and they had escaped. And some of them that went back after the Civil War, Reconstruction and everything, thought everything was going to be fine. Well, as soon as they got back to the lure of family and friends and what they knew, all of a sudden they were faced with Jim Crow laws and some other repression and Ku Klux Klan, and that's and other forms of repression. So they may have had second thoughts, but we had none of that here, other than an organizing effort for the Ku Klux in the following century.
Yeah, it wasn't
Which didn't go
economically,
very
the
far.
post-Civil War was not great for African Americans in general sense, my understanding.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Sharecropping and things like
yeah.
that. Promises 40 acres and a mule, right? That didn't materialize, things like that. But they could actually own land and purchase acreage, like significant amount of land in Canada if they wanted to,
Oh
like
yeah,
you talked about.
and sometimes they were allowed to, in exchange for work. The payment plans were easy. We needed settlers here. We have to be honest. I mean, when the Americans conducted their war of aggression of 1812, 1814, they were able to pretty well run pretty well straight through from Detroit to Buffalo because we were so thinly settled. We were unable to really defend ourselves very well. We needed settlers. The British Army was spread pretty thin, and the militia, we needed more people for the militia to help defend the home front. But aside from the people we've talked about, I want to show your viewers a photograph, which takes us in a slightly different direction. This was a person who spent the time in Montreal, a couple of years in Montreal. That's Jefferson Davis and his wife, Verena. And that's a formal portrait taken during their time in Montreal. They put their kids in school up here. And this was a couple of years they spent in Canada before they went to Europe and then ultimately back to the States. But Jefferson Davis wasn't the only Confederate that came up here, because the little town of Niagara on the Lake I mentioned to you was full of Confederate generals. The Confederate envoy to Britain, a guy named James Mason, the former vice president of the United States, John Breckinridge, and the last secretary of war for Davis, Breckinridge. He lived in Niagara on the Lake, and he could see Fort Niagara, the American fort, right across the Niagara River. And in fact, he could hear the bugle calls waking the American soldiers in the morning. He was tantalizingly close, but there was an international border in between he and the Americans. And Abraham Lincoln, shortly before he died, and of course the Union was winning, was asked about what do we do about these Confederate leaders. He says best to let them run, because if we prosecute them, that will not help us get together again with the South. So basically, he suggested they should run, and run they did. And sometimes they didn't run very far, just across the border, like Breckinridge. Others went a little farther, like Jefferson Davis up to Montreal. But Niagara on the Lake, there was a number. Jubal Early, James Mason, Breckinridge. Avery, the head leader of the Ku Klux Klan, had a $60,000 reward on his head because of murder and terrorism with the KKK. He parked himself in Niagara on the Lake for quite a while. So we were the welcome mat yet again, and not just for plantation owners, but for some people that they got along pretty well. And in fact, Breckinridge, his neighbor, was in Niagara on the Lake for a time, was the publisher of the local newspaper, and he was quite sympathetic. He wrote very sympathetic articles about him. So we had a real interesting collection of people that I called it the attic. We acted as sort of an attic that when things got a little crazy down in your way. Robin Williams, I put that in the beginning of my book. Robin Williams said Canada is like the nice neighbor above the meth lab. We've sort of been an outlet for some of the people that wanted to get away from some of the madness, and some came and stayed permanently. Others came and just stayed for a little while until the heat was turned down. So it's been a very interesting thing it was a very interesting time being on the front row, watching this terrible conflict you had down there. And we benefited from it in many ways. We lost people, family members died in the Civil War, Canadians that went down to fight. Some of them went for the money, some went for the adventure. It was a two-way street.
Right. And it became kind of like Casablanca of the 19th century, right? Like the Canadians became spies, assassins, bootleggers, just a whole mix of kind of like the cantina in Star Wars, just a whole mix of opportunists.
And if you want to look to another era, we called them draft dodgers during the Vietnam War, but during the Civil War, they were called skedaddlers. And we had a large number of skedaddlers that came up here that wanted to escape military service. And as soon as they crossed the border, they'd thumb their nose back at the authorities, and they would get jobs and that sort of thing. Conversely, men called crimps, CRIMPS, would come up here looking to enlist young Canadian or British men in the Union, primarily the Union side, and they would get a fee for every person they brought back across the border and enlisted. And they would, ladies of the night would be enlisted to help them in this sort of activity. And the authorities here did not like the American crimps coming across the border and looking for naive young men to go and fight in their fight down there. So we had a great selection of people, spies, all sorts of spies, buyers of, horses, everything. It was just I would have given my eye teeth, because we had in London here, we had two big hotels. The one hotel was sort of the headquarters for the Confederacy, and the other hotel was the headquarters for the Union, and all the buyers and the spies would hang out there. And there's a story, and I've got it from two different sources, that Confederate families, several Confederate families were actually parked in the one hotel, the Tecumseh House Hotel. And one of the stories is that for a time, members of General Beauregard's family from the Confederacy were here. So it was an interesting time. I would have given my eye teeth to be walking around the streets of London, Ontario during the Civil War, because loose lips sink ships, and people were talking about all sorts of plots and all sorts of things. The Confederate spy operation in Toronto and Montreal was doomed because too many people were telling too much, and things like the plan to break into Johnson's Island off Sandusky and Lake Erie and free all the Confederate prisoners and generals and stuff. The word of that got out, and that failed. There were a number of things, a number of operations that failed because they couldn't keep a secret, or there were spies everywhere. It was an interesting time.
And even before the Civil War, weren't there kind of bounty hunters coming up there trying to look for escaped slaves and things like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They were the Fugitive Slave Act, I think it was, of 1830. I can't remember the year exactly, but it empowered people, slave owners, to hire people to go and retrieve their quote unquote property. And these people would come across the border, and they would, as best they could, they would try to, take people back to their rightful owners for a nice reward. The government up here tried to stop that. And what happened is that the black population, for instance, in the place called Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is right at the border, because of the predations of these bounty hunters, these people who are looking for warm black bodies to return to the South, the black population moved away from the border, so that if Americans, the little network of information, if the network told them that there were people in the area, they could prepare more easily. If you're right on the border, by the time your abduction has been reported to the authorities, you may already be back in the States, and it's too late.
Right. Wow. It really is interesting. The Canadian history there of that time really is fascinating. I think you really encapsulated a lot of that kind of frontier happenings and things like that in the book. It's really well written. We're at about 38 minutes. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed before we wrap up this discussion?
Yeah, well, there was a sort of a postscript toward the end of the book. We had, while we were willing to accept, or at least not prevent, members of the Ku Klux from crossing the border and finding refuge here, later on, following, and the Ku Klux was sort of driven out of existence, or at least driven underground, following the Ku Klux Act of 1871, that all these prosecutions, and the two people I mentioned in my book were fled prosecution. One from the middle of his trial, Avery, from the middle of his trial. His friends had a horse just outside the door. He bolted from the courtroom onto the horse, made his way up to Canada. So he escaped justice that way. But there was, following The Birth of a Nation, the film of 1915, there was a rebirth, or a resurgence of the Ku Klux, now called the Ku Klux Klan. And it was a terribly racist movie and very upsetting to a lot of people. It said that the Ku Klux was the savior of the white race, and that black people were, I won't even go into it, but they portrayed them absolutely horribly. D.W. Griffith was a terrible racist. He was a great cinematographer, but he was terribly racist. And the interesting thing that I found is that, and I'm not I'm stressing that I'm pointing this out because we are not, while we abolished slavery earlier than elsewhere, perhaps, we were not, the rank and file people in Canada weren't weren't saints by any means. In the birth of a nation triggered the growth of the Ku Klux Klan. It grew rather rapidly. There was a lot of immigration happening into the States at the time of the First World War and shortly after, and a lot of resentment about immigrants and other people. And so there was a real resurgence of the Ku Klux. They had millions of people signing up and attending these cross-burning ceremonies and initiations and that sort of thing. And eventually, the Ku Klux Klan decided to expand into Canada, and they had a couple of pretty significant efforts back in the 1920s, 1924, 25, 26, in that era. And I was quite stunned to learn about a few rallies. And I've got a photograph here. This was a rally of the Ku Klux Klan just outside of London, the city I'm in now, in 1925 in a little town called Dorchester. And it attracted 1,000 people, and they initiated 200 people in one night. They had a 40-foot tall cross that they burned, and they were signing up members and trying to make a go of it. Well, Ontario was, you've heard of the Orange Lodge?
No, I don't know what that is.
Okay, it's a Protestant. It's a Protestant Irish organization that dislikes Catholics. It promotes the British monarchy. It's our it's our organization of bigots, basically, in Canada, and it was very pervasive and held all the levers of power. We were very Protestant in this province, and you had to be a member of the Loyal Orange Lodge in order to really get anywhere in the Ontario government. In the course of 100 years, only 3 or 4 mayors of Toronto were not Orangemen, and 4 of our prime ministers were members of the Orange Lodge. At the time, it was considered they passed it off as a fraternal organization, but basically it was sort of the Ku Klux Klan without the sheets. Okay. Very bigoted, anti-Catholic, anti-French, anti-immigrant, anyone that is not white Protestant Irish stock. Okay. Irish was the bonus, but you had to be Protestant and you had to be white. So the problem was the Ku Klux Klan came up here and they had all these rallies like the picture I just showed you. And they basically ran into some competition they didn't have in the southern states or even in the northern states. The Orange Lodge was very, very powerful. And if you were a bigot and you didn't like other people, you were probably already a member of the Orange Lodge. So they had competition for the bigotry. And in fact, shortly after the Depression got rolling, the Ku Klux Klan abandoned Canada. They gave up on us. They're hopeless up there. We can't. There's no fertile ground. It's already occupied, right? So, and personally, my background is Irish Protestant, and I'm convinced that my distant relatives or ancestors back then must have been members of the Loyal True Orange Lodge. It's a very interesting sort of wrinkle we have. It was a sort of a way of, fending off the KKK, but we weren't better because we fended off the KKK. We were just as bad. We just had a competing organization. I thought that was a really interesting wrinkle to this whole thing. And the Ku Klux organization was established following the Civil War, okay, in reaction to giving Black people rights. And the resurgence of that after the Birth of a Nation film, it wasn't that we were holier than thou. We were just as bad. We just had our own bigots and haters.
Really fascinating. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot more in this book. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff, the KKK, a lot of more Civil War, and it's just very well put together. Like, I'm really impressed with the writing and the structure of the book. So you broke it into 3 different parts, but it's also, people can listen to it. You can get a paperback and a Kindle too, right?
Yeah, it is. There's no hardcover. It's just paperback, or ebook or audiobook. We've actually got a movie option. Maybe someday it'll be a movie. I'm not holding my breath, but it's got so many interesting characters, and it's just full of interesting information, and it's opened people's eyes up here who have read it. They said, I never knew that, because we thought the American Civil War was America's war. Well, we had a front row seat, and we dipped our toes in it, and we made room for people that came up to join us, so we were involved intimately in that. And there was also one other aspect that I forgot to mention. It was, we tended to side with the South in many ways, because first of all, Britain was addicted to King Cotton and had traditional trading routes with the South. But we were worried that when it was apparent that the North was going to win the war, that after they defeated the South, they would turn their guns north, and they would complete the war of aggression they started in 1812-14 and take over Canada. And William Seward, the Secretary of State, was constantly pushing to annex Canada. So we were concerned for our own safety and tended to be sympathetic toward the South. And it's interesting that shortly after the Civil War, one of our leaders decided we better band together now, or we may be in trouble. And we became Canada in 1867. And it was out of fear that we might be embroiled in more conflict.
Interesting. Fascinating. And where's the best place for people to reach out with you, Brian, if they want to talk with you?
They can get me at Chip at Large on Twitter, or just Chip Martin at Facebook. On Facebook, Chip Martin is my nickname. My legal name is Brian, and I write all my books in Brian. The very first publisher, his name was Richard. Don't call me Dick Taylor. He said, we can't have an author named Chip Martin for a murder trial, a murder case. And I went, okay, whatever you want. So even though Brian is my legal name, I go by it for my books, but I'm Chip Martin in terms of social media. And what were the
two true crime books that you worked on? What were the crime?
The first one was called Bucksbaum, A Murderous Affair, and it was about a very wealthy millionaire nursing home operator and very religious man who fell in with some bad people and arranged the roadside murder of his wife in a very public fashion. It was a nationwide story. That was back in the 80s. And then a few years later, one of our lawyers in London committed the largest bank fraud committed by an individual in Canadian history at that time. He defrauded some of our biggest banks and some of his best friends, grand total of about $150 million, and he was sent to prison. So those were my two true crime books. And then I did a book about my great uncle Ernie, who became fabulously wealthy with a gold mine in Northern Ontario, and was the right-hand man for Sir Harry Oakes, who was wound up being murdered in the Bahamas. A few books have been written about him. And then I did 6 baseball books, a variety of topics about some of our Canadian contributions to the game and about some very prominent people in the American game, Barney Dreyfuss, Pud Galvin, and I had a nice run with baseball books. And this is my first straight history book in some time, and it's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. Just published October 25th, 2022. Again, the full title is From Underground Railroad to Rebel Refuge, Canada in the Civil War. And the author, again, is Brian Martin. So Brian, or Chip, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, William. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Thanks so much.
Likewise. Stay there.